today we are going to be having a session on legal and ethical issues in clinical supervision. We're honored to have Dr. Karen Enyedy. She's the former training director at the HELP group in Sherman Oaks in the Los Angeles area. And currently she's teaching at Vanderbilt University. So welcome, Dr. Enyedy.
I'm going to start off with talking a little bit about how laws and ethics intersect, because we can't have one without the other. And then about a few topics in terms of things for you all to stay aware of as supervisors, such as informed consent, competence, multiple relationships. We'll talk a bunch about confidentiality and documentation, and then we'll end up with some issues around liability for us as supervisors. I think one of the things that we should have as a goal as a supervisor is helping our supervisees think through this intersection between legal and ethical issues, so that we have some items that are, some things we deal with that are both legal and ethical issues, that something might be a legal thing that we have to do and ethical, for example, reporting child abuse. And there's some things that we come across that are illegal and unethical, which could be intimate relationships with a supervisee or with a client, for example. And so that we're also thinking out loud with our supervisees, so they're also learning about thinking through these intersections between legal and ethical issues.
Great. I think it would be wonderful if you could give us a case vignette.
So let me talk about a case. So this is Amy. She's been your supervisee for a year as she accumulates her postmaster's hours towards licensure. Her clinical notes and treatment plans have been impeccable. And so the supervisor skims them quickly, signs them to get them off her desk. In one of the notes, though, the supervisor didn't fully read it. Amy had written that the teenage client, who has a history of depression and suicidal ideation, exhibited sadness and anger that her girlfriend broke up with her, and she didn't think she would ever find another partner. And then later in the clinical note, the therapist wrote, the client reported that there was no one else to talk to about this because her parents don't know she's bisexual. So then Amy then wrote in the note, the therapist provided her with the suicide prevention hotline number and told the client she would not tell her parents anything as long as the client promises to call the hotline. So Amy did not consult with the supervisor during or after the session, and so the supervisor didn't know what occurred in the session. So the discussion questions are, what legal and ethical issues come up for you with this situation? And also, what are some things that the supervisor could have done differently in this situation? This next section is going to be also about a discussion amongst the group of you. And so this will set the stage for the rest of the things that we're going to talk about. So from your own experience as a supervisor or a supervisee, or from what you observed occurring in other supervisor or supervisee relationships, I want you to talk about some ethical challenge that you have observed in the supervision relationship, and also what made these things ethically challenging for you or for the situation. We encourage you all to stay up to date with the laws, the regs that are in your district, in your area, and in your state, obviously. And so on the Moodle site, we have a lot of resources for BOP and BBS. But you also really should be checking the BOP and the BBS websites frequently so that you're sure you have all the latest information. For example, on BBS, there's for 2019, Assembly Bill 93 that lays out a bunch of changes.
And of course, obtain the actual bill. Here, those memo that the BBS put out. We'll hit just some of the supervision-related parts here. This speaks to the board's right to audit supervisors to ensure they've met the qualifications, and talks about maintaining your records of those qualifications. This one speaks to qualifications for supervisors, including having held a license for at least 2 years of the past 5-year period that precedes supervision. And then, for at least 2 of the past 5 years preceding supervision, the supervisor needs to have practiced psychotherapy or provided direct clinical supervision of psychotherapy. This is in addition to other qualifications like holding a current California license and so on. This talks about specific supervision responsibilities. And then this one warrants attention too. The law now allows triadic supervision, which is defined as face-to-face supervision between one supervisor and two supervisees. And it goes on to talk about the conditions of that. And then there's some other things as well.
So those are really important that you're staying on top of, because not only is it going to affect you as a licensed person, but also your supervisees. So keeping up to date. And also both BOP and BBS allow you to get their push notifications in terms of news that is coming out of the board. So those are really good things to keep in mind. We all know about informed consent because we do it with our therapy clients, but it's just as important to do it with our supervisees. They need to know what is going to be required of them in supervision. So some things to inform your supervisee of, and this is not at all an exhaustive list, but the process of supervision. Are you going to be using, the tapes you're going to be using, expectations that they will be discussing countertransference, cultural issues, etc. Informing them about the feedback and evaluation criteria, what is all going to happen. And with different stages of trainees, it's going to look a little bit differently. In each of your sites might be a little bit different, but for your students or your trainees or supervisees to know what that will be. Paperwork, procedures, and due dates is important to keep them up to date on and informed about. Also, you're all in organizations, so HR might be involved in certain situations, so that's always a good thing to fill your supervisees in on. If you're in a formal training department, are there going to be other supervisees that you might be talking to, or a director of the training department? If they're in graduate school, are you going to be communicating with the grad program? And some of you will have a supervision contract, some of you will have a supervision agreement, some of you will just have this conversation based on what your organization requires of you or allows you to do. So those are just a few things to talk about in informed consent. So what I wanted to do now is just pause for a few minutes and just have a group discussion about what are some other things that you discuss with your supervisees at the outset of the supervision experience.
So a very important area that you've highlighted next is competence, and the competence not simply of the supervisee, but equally or more importantly even is that of the supervisor.
Absolutely. And again, it's kind of like with informed consent, we think about that with our clients, our therapy clients, but same with competence. We often think it's just the supervisee who needs to be competent, but obviously we as supervisors need to be competent. Part of the big purpose of this class is so that all of you can increase your competence as being supervisors. So just briefly, for supervisee competence, you as a supervisor should focus both on the training needs of the supervisee, so that's your teacher role, as well as your responsibility to protect the supervisee's clients. So that's your gatekeeping role. And then you're going to also want to make sure you know how to assess your supervisee's competence and assign cases, training, readings, whatever, based on that level of competence. Now, I know we're going to have a whole nother module on competence, so I won't go too deep on that with your supervisee here, but we'll keep bringing it up. And then in terms of your competence, right, you'll need to ensure that you participate in continuing education, professional networking, get consultation on your supervision. You should be aware of the types of cases that you consider yourselves competent to supervise. And then, as we've talked about in a prior week, multicultural competence in supervision, it includes both your work with your supervisee and with the supervisee's clients. So all those pieces are really critical that we're always thinking about. Are we at the level we really should be as a supervisor?
One of the areas that you have highlighted before and that's really important is multiple relationships. And I think this is a frequent issue in many of the settings.
We are all in organizations where you might have multiple roles and multiple relationships with your supervisees. And multiple relationships really can occur at all different levels. It can be between a supervisor and a supervisee. between the therapist, your supervisee, and the clients, or between you and the client. So there's all different ways that we might intersect. In supervision, it's when a supervisor has a prior, concurrent, and or future relationship with a supervisee that might be out of the scope of the professional relationship. It's one way to think about a multiple relationship. Now, some relationships are against BOP and BBS statutes. For example, you can't supervise a former therapy client. So again, that's why you need to always be looking at the laws, the ethics, et cetera, around relationships. But I think the other thing is not all multiple relationships are harmful. You might be in a setting where you are the group supervisor and the individual supervisor, but you also might be involved in an HR situation with your supervisee. So then you're also in more of potentially a disciplinarian relationship. But there are also times when your organization has a holiday party and you all go to the holiday party and you're sitting with your supervisees. And so that could be potentially a multiple relationship. So the important ethical considerations concerning these relationships are the likelihood that the relationship will impair your judgment and the risk to the supervisee of exploitation. Those are two really critical things. So some questions that you could ask yourself when deciding about socializing with supervisees. Could their socialization impact my ability to give negative evaluation or terminate a supervisee? So something to think about when you're potentially getting into a multiple relationship or a socializing relationship. Another question could be, can I explain and justify my decision around socializing to an ethics board? Another, what advice would I give a colleague in a similar situation? You could also ask yourself, in my setting, how appropriate is socializing and what is the professional maturity of my supervisee? How might others react knowing that I'm socializing with some supervisees, but not all of them? Because that can absolutely come up. How comfortable am I with my actions being known publicly or by my boss? So how might that person respond to this socializing or multiple relationship? And what is the worst possible scenario that could emerge from my decision to socialize with a supervisee? So that's just one set of questions, and I recommend you keep those and ask yourself those questions when trying to make a decision. And again, not all multiple relationships are bad, and so those are going to help you kind of think through that.
I think one of the most frequent multiple relationships they have is the supervisors who are both administrative supervisors and clinical supervisors, yes, and the complexity of that. And having done that yourself, I know maybe you could have a few reflections on that, because I think that's major.
It's so major. One of the great things about the informed consent process is you can also talk about the multiple hats you wear as a supervisor, and to be transparent with your supervisee about, there's going to be times when it's going to be more administrative supervision. We're going to be talking about paperwork deadlines, or we're going to be talking about competency concern, versus the clinical piece of thinking about the case and understanding the client, for example. And so that talking to your supervisor about those roles, but also when you do move into those roles, being aware of how your supervisee is reacting. As a group, think about some examples of multiple relationships with supervisees that are not harmful. And what are some of the things you think about when deciding if you will enter into a multiple relationship with a supervisee? Because all of you are going to have many, many examples of this, and it'll be good to share them with each other. Clients, there are some interesting things to think about in terms of confidentiality and privacy in the supervisorial relationship also. First off, supervisors, as a supervisor, you are mandated to maintain the confidentiality of the clients you supervise. So you have access to all the information about those clients, including the clinical notes, the documentation. So you are bound to that confidentiality just like your supervisees are. And as a supervisor, you should really ensure that your supervisees are discussing confidentiality with their clients, particularly in relation to the supervisory relationship. So that's an important component. Now, in terms of the relationship between you and your supervisee, There's no real expectation that supervision meetings are confidential, and you should be sure that your supervisees are aware of that. So during your informed consent process. However, to build a trusting relationship with your supervisee, there should be a sense of safety and privacy in the supervisory dyad. And in terms of the privacy and what you will disclose, your supervisees should know who are their evaluations going to go to. For example, are they going to their graduate school if they're still in school? Do they go to the director of the program? Do they go to HR? And then also, you're going to want to know about your agency's procedures for dealing with employee behavior issues that might come up during the supervision. So involvement of human resources, program directors, et cetera, as well as things having to do with the American with Disabilities Act. If there's certain things that you as a supervisor would need to go to HR with. And again, that's going to vary depending on your organization. So you're going to want to find that out ahead of time. If you don't know it now, it might be a good thing for you to do over the course of the week. So I don't know if you can see it in the frame of this video, but in the background, I have a t-shirt that I have framed, and the top says consult, 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 and the bottom it says document, document, document. Because as we all know, if it's not written down, it didn't happen. So documenting your supervision is really, really important, just like it is obviously of documenting therapy sessions with clients. It's really both a legal requirement as well as an ethical duty to protect the client. If you're writing things down in your own supervision notes, things that you've been talking with your supervisee about. So some items that you might want to maintain, though, for each of your supervisees is if you did do a contract or agreement, you should keep that, have that documented. If you have a summary of your supervisee's experiences, their training, notation of your supervision sessions. And again, that might vary site by site of what you can include in those notes, but those are good things to have a discussion about. In my supervision notes, I would document directives I would give to my supervisee, like, well, I want you to go and read this article, or why don't you try this with your client? I would document if they were on time or late. Also, any progressive discipline steps you've taken. So the things that you're doing as a supervisor, you'll want to keep in your own supervision notebook so that you have a record of your documentation.
Documentation is just not a nuisance because that's how supervisees sometimes view it. But in fact, it's a legal requirement and it has huge implications for client care. Even minimally, it's required because a supervisee could become ill or be absent during a crisis. And if there's nothing written in the record about previous work,
Absolutely.
a huge ethical and legal issue.
Yeah. And just like the case vignette at the beginning with Amy and the supervisor who wasn't thoroughly reading the notes, it's really important that we're staying like on the top of our game, because who knows that there might be some little thing in a clinical documentation that could be harmful to the client, or that you need to follow up on from a safety perspective. So all the documentation that you do and that your supervisee does is important to always be paying attention to.
And you're also raising something that's come up before, and that's metacompetence. The supervisees do not know what they do not know. Therefore, there are times when they write something in a note and they do not realize the importance of that.
So there's multiple ways. We're, as supervisors, we are the licensed person in the situation. We are in a power position, if you will. We are ultimately responsible for our supervisees in the work that they're doing. So in terms of direct liability, basically what direct liability is that if you do something or you fail to do something that you should have done and it results in damages to someone, you can be held directly responsible. So on the slide, there's a lot of different examples, but if you're not providing supervision consistently, if you're not paying attention, if you're giving them your supervisee inappropriate treatment recommendations, if you're not following up on a safety concern, and then there is harm to the client, you could be held liable for the situation because you weren't doing your due diligence in your job as a supervisor. Now, in terms of vicarious liability, the definition of it is that you are exposed to the commissions and omissions of your supervisees through your association in the supervision relationship. And so the literature talks a lot about how we as supervisors are liable for your supervisees' actions because we are in a position of responsibility and authority. The supervisee was under the direct control of the supervisor, and the supervisor or the supervisor's agency or organization may profit from the actions of their supervisees. So when you're looking in the literatures around vicarious liability, those three components come up. And so it could be that your supervisee does something completely, from what you can tell, random from what you had told them to do, or you would never advise them to do that. You were always there for supervision. So it was completely out of the blue to you, but that supervisee caused harm to the client. Vicarious liability might be in play here. The big question then is, how do you reduce the risk? Like, how do you take care of yourself? How do you take care of the public and your supervisee? So certainly, kind of like we've been talking about, provide the appropriate amount of supervision, be attentive, document what you're doing, as we just talked about, provide quality supervision and training, and document that you did it so that you are seeing what your supervisees need in terms of continuing education or things to read or watching more videotapes or listening to more audio tapes. Develop a learning plan for your supervisee that changes over time depending on their needs. We know it's a developmental process. So if you're developing learning plans for your supervisees, the hope is that then they're more likely going to increase their skills. Identify early and often any competency issues and document what those are and what you've done to help remediate them. Develop a clear expectation about red flag issues. You all work in high intensity settings with a multiple number of clients and supervisees. So your supervisees really need to know your expectation in terms of red flags. What is a red flag and what do they do about it? So is it child abuse allegations? Is it a Tarasoff situation? Do they need to call you right away? So what are the parameters around that? As well as if they can't get a hold of you, who can they talk to? So all of those pieces will help reduce the chances of you being held liable or really ultimately anything happening to the client, right? And then, like I said earlier, thoroughly read all the documentation that's sent to you so that you really are in the loop about what's going on with all the cases that you supervise. Those are just a few of the ways.
So helpful. Thank you. I think the other thing that was implicit in all this is that each supervisor should have the ethics code of their profession readily available.
Absolutely, Carol. I mean, the great thing is you can get them all online. And what I would do is I would have them all bookmarked. And if I'm working with a social worker as a supervisee, I'll pull up NASW's ethics code and I'll say, so let's see where this fits in and let's think through out loud about all of these things. So I'm glad you brought that up.
Thank you so very much. And we appreciate your time and expertise.
Thanks. Thank you.